representatives of civil society organizations, development partners, and members of the Fourth Estate, to examine ways and means to grow and expand Zimbabwe's development finance sources in a sustainable and creative manner. The country's diverse financing frameworks should be explored and find innovative solutions aimed at growing and expanding the economy. In the above context, therefore, the specific objectives of the ZEDCON 2023 are to 1, promote knowledge management as an important driver of policy dialogue and good policy planning and implementation. 2, to foster dialogue that promotes the exchange of ideas and innovative thinking among researchers, development practitioners, policymakers, private sector, and government. 3, to encourage and enhance research on economic and policy issues related to the development of the economy by promoting evidence-based policymaking. And lastly, but not least, to provide an opportunity for young researchers, diasporans, and private organizations to share knowledge with policymakers. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 3 days, we'll hear from experts, policymakers, and practitioners from around the academia who will share their thoughts, insights, and experiences on how to mobilize public and private resources for sustainable development. We'll also hear commentary on the presentations from experts drawn from industry and commerce, academia, banking, agriculture, and the SME sector as well as development partners and parliamentarians. This will give an unrivaled opportunity to explore the current trends and innovations in financing for development, and we hope to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing the economy as we implement the National Development Strategy, NDS-1, and march towards achieving Vision 2030. We also need to find ways to scale up investments as laid out in the African Union Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goals, these are your SDGs, while addressing the immediate and long-term challenges facing the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference provides another unique platform for established academics and young researchers to present their solution-oriented research to policymakers and decision makers and proffer recommendations in tandem with broad themes outlined as resource mobilization, inflation and exchange rates, the role of the private sector and resource, and the critical importance of the informal sector. Drawing from our official mantra as a nation, that is to say, Nika inova kwa nevene vayo, lizwe liyakiwa kabanikazi balo, none but ourselves. This is the philosophy as enunciated by His Excellency. It suffices to say that sustainable socio-economic development therefore requires solutions that are homegrown and developed domestically. Hence, we need to intensify our efforts in mobilizing resources within the country, as we are all aware that currently our capacity for external finances is limited for various reasons. In this regard, upscaling domestic resource mobilization initiatives remains critical in order to adequately fund NDS-1 programs and projects during the second half of the National Development Strategy period. The presentations and discussions during the next 2 to 3 days will make a significant contribution to the development and implementation of effective policies, including shaping the framework and the process for the 2024 national budget, which will be coming up soon, as well as assisting and implementing the NDS-1 during the second half. It is our collective expectation that we'll have honest and robust engagements based on facts and evidence, following which we will all agree on implementation and pathways on the proposed solutions. Let us remember that without giving and sharing our honest and grounded views, we are not doing each other and our country a favor. So we encourage all of you to put your best foot forward and make impactful contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in sharing the hope that this conference will be a productive and engaging forum for all of us, and that we will leave here with new ideas, new partnerships, and a renewed commitment to the cause of sustainable development of our country, anchored on the theme for ZEDCON 2023, which is public and private resource mobilization for sustainable development. I thank you. Siyabonga, ndatenda.
Please, a round of applause, Deputy Minister of Finance and Investment Promotion, Honourable David Kudekwashe Mnangagwa. Thank you, Deputy Minister. Now then, ZEDCON 2022. If those of you who are here, as the Deputy Minister said in his speech, it wasn't a talk shop. This was about people coming together, sharing their ideas, sharing their thoughts, knowledge sharing. We had some incredible presentations which we are going to have again in ZEDCON 2023. But I like what the Minister said, exchange ideas, assist in policy formulation, knowledge sharing. Now what is also important about this conference 2023, ZEDCON 2023, is that we are now streaming live on ZTN Prime. Now, why do I mention that? Well, it's because those of you who are watching ZEDCON online, you can also put your comments, please, to the various comment sections. You can also find us, obviously, on X or on the X Twitter handle, ZTN Prime. Put your comments, put your views, put your thoughts. We'll also bring those to the organizers of ZEDCON. And I think that makes this conference truly a national conference. It isn't just here in Victoria Falls with the delegates in front of us or the delegates here present. This also encompasses everybody out there in Zimbabwe who wants to contribute to the political discourse, contribute to policy formulation. Now, the way we're going to work in all the sessions in the next 3 days is each session will have a chairperson. And in this case, the chairperson for this morning, I'd like to call upon Honourable Clements Chidua as a Member of Parliament, but he can please come up, Honourable, come up. He will be the chairperson for this session. Please, a big round of applause for Honourable Chidua. I think you can do better than that, yeah? Now, Honourable Chidua will, of course, be chairing the session, but I thought that because it is quite an intensive session, this is the first session before tea, I thought I'd like to invite him up just to give a few words. Would you like to do it from there? Give a few words on explaining exactly what the session is about and what we're trying to achieve with it. Honourable Chidua, thank you.
Thank you, Director of Ceremonies and the Orgies. Let me acknowledge our Honorable Minister, Professor Mtuli Ngue, the Minister of State for Provincial Affairs and Devolution, Honorable Richard Moyo, the Honorable Deputy Minister of Finance, Economic Development and Investment Promotion, Honorable David Kudekwashe Mnangagwa, all esteemed delegates to the ZEDCON 2023, and I then write on protocols that have been observed already. ZEDCON 2023 comes at a time when Zimbabwe as a country, we have charted our path in terms of what we want to achieve as a country. Vision 2030 is our guiding document. It is our guiding blueprint in terms of where we want to be. As already said by the Honorable Deputy Minister, we are gathered here to deliberate on resource mobilization for sustainable development. But on issues to do with sustainable development, we are looking at social development, we are looking at economic development, environmental sustainability, issues to do with the inclusivity. And all these, if you check our Vision 2030, these are the 5 critical pillars that are holding Vision 2030. But the Vision 2030 that we are talking about is the Vision 2030 where the President is saying, we are not going to leave anyone behind. We are not going to leave any place behind. And everyone is going to be part of our journey as we march towards 2030. But in order for us to realize all these critical issues, we need financing. And it is the issue of financing that is very critical. And in Vision 2030, if you go through it, it clearly spells out that the development and growth of this country is going to be private sector led. And this is where we are saying government cannot do it on its own. Government cannot develop this country alone. We need the private sector. So, for the Vision 2030 to be realized, we have got our NDS1, where the implementation of NDS1 is done through programs and budgets. And the issue of sustainable development now comes into play. And we have said, how are we financing our programs? For the period from 2021 up to 2025, we have got a compendium of projects, and we require upward of above $40 billion US. And in order to fund these ones, most of the funding is coming from budget appropriation. And we have said this is not enough. And this is where we are saying we need to come up with the sustainable funding mechanisms. And the resource mobilization is what is needed now. And we have faced quite a number of problems. And some of these problems are structural. Some of the problems are because we have got a low culture of saving, and we have got a weak financial market. And all these would require us to develop so that we can fund our development agenda. So I'm also looking at the new sources of funding that are coming into play, which are through carbon trading. And this is an issue that we are all going to discuss here. And we are also going to be guided by the speech that was given by His Excellency at the United Nations General Assembly 78, where he employed us as Zimbabwe to transition to low carbon and resilient economy by increasing investments in renewable energy. And this again requires us to make use of sustainable means in terms of agriculture and the green economy. So as we move forward, we are saying the private sector should play its part, and in this session we are going to look at all this, which is the funding for development programs and borrowing from what the Honorable Deputy Minister just said, that we need a robust and honest discussion. So as we go to session 1, the presenters, the panel discussion is going to focus on expanding financing sources for development as we journey towards 2030. So I'm looking at the deliberations that are going to be honest and robust. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Chidua. Thank you. I think that's very key there, and thank you for those comments. We need to have open and honest discussions. There will be lots of time for you to be brought in to discuss. Questions will be asked, and this is why I keep urging those who are watching us online, those who are watching through whatever platform, and even, of course, the delegates here present. Let's get the debate going. Let's get the discussion going, because this is probably the foremost economic conference to be held in Zimbabwe every year, a conference in which, from here, there will be a list of recommendations taken. I've been assured by the Ministry of Finance Secretariat that they will put together a list of recommendations, and I'm hoping and I'm pushing for them to be able to, for me to announce them at the end of the conference, so you're clear on what the recommendations coming from here. That will then be taken with the Ministry of Finance for discussion, and hopefully, as it was last year, a lot of them will be incorporated into policy and into the national budget. In fact, there is a 2022 report. It is about 101 pages long, so it is quite a mouthful, a readful, if I can call it that. However, hopefully during the course of the next 3 days, we'll be touching on that, and I may ask some of the Ministry of Finance representatives to come up and actually maybe highlight some of the issues in there. I'll give you a good example about how ZEDCON can be effective. If you remember last year, the delegates who were here, one of the major discussions was about money supply growth. Do you remember that? In fact, a lot of the papers talked about about money supply growth, the correlation between money supply, inflation, the exchange rate, and how we had to get that under control. Well, sure enough, what happened? Zero money supply targeting at the Reserve Bank. Also, of course, broad money at the Ministry of Finance are under control, looking at contractors being overcharged. Just to give you a very small example of some of the policy issues discussed last year that were actually implemented. And I believe that that is exactly what ZEDCON is all about. Now, without further ado, I would like to call up our first speaker. He's actually giving a presentation on sources of climate financing, the keynote presentation for this session. I'd like to call upon Mr. Tinashe Charles Mashavave. He's Principal Economist, Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment Promotion. Please, a big round of applause for Tinashe. It's a long walk, don't worry. Welcome, Tinashe.
Good morning. Yes, hoping that you had a safe trip to Vic Falls. Allow me to write on the previous protocols that have just gone before me, so that I'll just dash into the presentation, my presentation, and also even to catch up on lost time. So I'll be presenting today on, I thought I was going to have a mobile mic, you know, when I used to preaching in church. Okay.
We can get to one. I can get to one.
So, I've got a big ice cream. Thank you. Okay, so I want to talk about how we can capitalize, or how Zimbabwe can actually capitalize on emerging and innovative sources of climate financing, right? So I will not belabor you much in going to where we really started, or the issue of climate financing. It's an issue that started long back, you know, when the history stretches as far as back as the formation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was actually in 1992 after the Rio Conference. That's the most famous Rio Conference. And also the agenda kept on coming up, even up to the time when there was the formation of the Kyoto Protocol. We talk about the most current one that we are running along with, which is the Paris Agreement, which is sort of like set the tone for nations or globally or parties to the Paris Agreement to sort of like scale up efforts, mitigation and adaptation efforts towards a low carbon trajectory. So Zimbabwe is a signatory to all these agreements, and also is entitled, maybe like sort of to receive also even funding under these financial arrangements of these agreements. You know, we have the various sources of climate financing around the globe. You talk of the loans, the grants, some of in the philanthropy and all this kind of stuff. But the challenge that is there now is how to mobilize adequate and predictable financial flows as stipulated in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. So it's quite an impediment, especially across the global south countries. Here I'm talking about countries like, you saw the SEEDS, the Small Island Development States. I'm talking about the ILAC, the indigenous Latin group, American countries. You talk about countries in Africa, some in Asia, so which fall into this category of the global south countries. And evidence also points to the fact that there's limited comprehension of the available and diverse sources of finance and how to mobilize the requisite sources. And the study approach, how I went about this study, was to try and explore the available literature. You know, there's online literature, there's printed literature around the issues of climate financing, on how it has been progressing over the years. And that's how I explaining that. So what was the main objective of the study was to try to explore how Zimbabwe can leverage on the local, the national, the transnational financing drawn from private, public, and other sources to address the climate change and to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. Right. So one thing that is striking is that under the Paris Agreement, or the issue of climate financing, as I was saying, there was a pledge that was made some years back, maybe stretching as far as 2009, by developing countries, the developing country parties to the Paris Agreement, that for each year, they were going to mobilize resources maybe to amounting to around 100 billion every year to support the developing country parties in terms of their mitigation and adaptation actions, as they reflected in their national development, nationally determined contributions. In Zimbabwe, we have our own national determined contributions, and we require almost about 9 billion to implement those. That was the figure that was submitted as of 2021 when we submitted our revised NDCs. But, you know, climate change is continuing to change, so maybe those needs and priorities, they are also changing. So, but we have that 9 billion that is to be raised. But where do we get that from? From the previous speakers, we draw that fiscal support alone cannot do that. But then we need to crowd in the private sector to come in, to join hands, that so that we combine forces. So how I did this, now I started to explore how the global landscape of climate finance is structured right now. So we're saying there are financial mechanisms, the financial mechanisms under the UNFCCC to try and to facilitate the provision of financial resources to developing country parties, which is accountable to the COP and decides on the policies and programs and priorities. And the pledges that have been made, I talked about the pledge, the $100 billion pledge was made in 2009 at COP 15. That was in Copenhagen. And it was reaffirmed in 2010 that it still stood. But still, when we came to the formation of the Paris Agreement in 2015, that's when they started to do the firm commitment, say, we are going to do this by 2020. But up to now, we haven't had much of that. So some of the arguments, when they sit year in, year out, for their conference of parties meetings, they say it's an issue that is still under consideration. And some coming up with these antics to say that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So you see, in terms of these deliberations, it just goes to show that it's not maybe in good faith. They are just playing with time. So then, but shall we continue to wait as a country to say until the 100 billion comes? I think we need to start to be in motion, to start to think of beyond the pledge. And to say, so we are saying, those failed pledges, actually, it creates scope for the developing country parties to push for a reliable financing as well as explore innovative financing mechanisms and instruments. That's where we find ourselves in. And most of the country, and you see, under the Paris Agreement, you see, there are various entities, maybe that are also, that can be entrusted with the institutional and technical capacity building with regards to planning and accessing and delivering the finance, including engaging in multilateral climate finance. And some of the typical examples, you know, the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and all these other funds. Right. So what we have before us is like a trend analysis of how the landscape of climate finance has evolved over the years. And when you look at that graph before you, you can see that there's generally an increasing from 2011, and which is attributed to the growth in renewable energy and transport sectors. And cumulatively, the climate finance reached $4.8 trillion US That's a lot of money. My minister would say money, big money, 4.8 trillion. So, but where is this money? Between 2011 and 2020, or at an annual average of 480 billion. And in 2021, the climate finance flows estimated were around 850 to 940 billion. So the cumulative average annual growth rate of 7%, or at least 4.35 trillion, is needed annually by 2030 to meet the global climate objectives. And Africa requires around 52.7 billion. That's against the country's the current spending of around 11 billion. All right, I'm being told it's up 7 minutes left. Right, so I want to rush into the two main instruments that I was looking at. I was looking at green bonds. Green bonds, just like any other bonds, it just operates like any other bonds. But the only distinction that it has maybe an environmental perspective. Environmental perspective, that is, but it can also come with tax incentives, and the qualification of a green bond status is often verified by a third party, such as the Climate Bond Standard, which certifies that the bond will fund projects that include the benefits to the environment. So the World Bank is the one that is renowned for issuing such bonds, which we started in 2008, and up to now is actually funded projects amounts to the tune of 14.4 billion, which is supported over 111. So its benefits, it attracts diverse investor base, which is where we are today, the pension funds, asset managers, and offers greater flexibility and lower volatility. Those are some of the advantages that we have there. So, who are the participants in these markets? We have the issuers, who can be government, corporations, or entities that are selling bonds and other debt instruments. We have underwriters, that's the investment banks, and other financial institutions that help the issuer, and the purchasers, that's those we have. So, in the green bond market, how is it? The Climate Bonds Initiative estimates that the issuance of green bonds stood at 269.5 billion in 2020, with the United States of America being the largest player. And the annual issuance could exceed 1 trillion mark by end of 2023. And in Africa, the major players, there's South Africa, Egypt, we have Morocco, right? And South Africa actually in 2022 received the first rand-denominated bond to the tune of 200 million from the African Development Bank. I think in Africa also, I think South Africa and Nigeria, we have a legal framework in terms of the green bonds. So that African countries, we still have a work to do. So there's certain criticisms against green bonds. Perhaps I'll combine these when I've finished with the next part, which is the carbon credits. So the carbon credits, it is just a tradable certificate that constitutes an offset of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. It's a ton of gas, not a ton of bricks. So it goes to show you the metrics that are involved. It could be a complicated measure. Right in this room, we can say how much ton of carbon dioxide or oxygen that we're breathing in this room. So it goes to show you that there's a technical expertise that are needed. So not all carbon offsets are equal, as this largely depends on the types of greenhouse gases and the respective global warming potential and the sequestration method. So basically, the issue of carbon trading is well dealt with under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and there are carbon registries that are used to certify all these carbon credits. And the common carbon credit registries that we have is, we know the VERA, which is the Verified Carbon System, the Gold Standard, the Climate Action, American Corporate Carbon Registry, and the Green E-Climate Standard, among others. So that's the carbon market. So it's mainly carried by a degree of regulation, and the price is determined in both compliance and voluntary markets. So basically we have two markets. The more regulated market is the compliance market, where there are certain offsets, limits that are set under the cap and trade system. Then we have the voluntary carbon, where it's actually a mutual agreement between parties And recently, like Zimbabwe signed the ITMOS with the UAE, with the internationally traded mitigation of outcomes. So the market is there. The price was 978.56 billion as of 2022, and the prices can fluctuate greatly with the demand. So most of the African countries, they are still establishing regulatory frameworks, but our friend Tanzania has had a regulatory framework in 2022, and it has managed to mobilize around $1 billion. And for 2023, they're actually expecting investments of around 20 billion from carbon marketing. So in Zimbabwe, coming to our local context, we have recently promulgated the SI 150 of 2023, which is a regulatory framework for carbon trading in Zimbabwe, so that at least there is some confidence within the investors that they may be guided accordingly in terms of trading on this market. So when the requisite, the DNA, that the designation authority has been established, and the registry, I think it's work in progress, so that at least they are able to operate with others. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, before I go to my conclusion, I just wanted to draw our attention to a bit of one or two examples. When we have now gone into this, to be able to actually participate effectively in these markets, you know, then I said, then what? Where are we going to use the monies for? So I was just brainstorming and thinking, and I was saying, when I sit in these other various meetings, they talk about the cook stoves. That's a common issue. And I said, then when we've cooked, then what? So I just was thinking, where else can we invest our monies? When we look at Zimbabwe, we have other points or other entry points where we can actually use the monies for. Let's look around at those places where we have unregulated mining, for instance, and the ugly landscape that we look at. But for how long shall we continue to look at that land, which is against maybe the requirements of the UNCCD? We are talking about the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification. Then we have the CBD, that was the one on biodiversity. What are we saying about it? Shall we continue to watch? So our entry point could be to say, we put in nature-based solutions. We finance nature-based solutions, like reforestation. Let's look at the chain, where it goes now. When we have improved diversity, then we have opportunities for our tourism, ecotourism. The non-timber forest products, they can also come in with the possibility of value addition, a possibility of payment of ecosystem services, and also we accrue more carbon credits by these methods. Another entry point could be the circular economy. That's the waste economy. When you walk around, say, the streets of Harare, every corner there is this heap of waste, which ends up in the streams, ends up blocking our waterways. But when we go circular, then we see that this, when we do investments, actually we can actually do away with the waste, or actually we can extend its life that's through the recycling, through repairing, through reusing it. So that could be another entry point. And I want you to reflect also on another entry point. Just think of the most remote place in Zimbabwe, where the national electricity grid may take decades to reach. So why can't we reach those points with maybe the mini grids, the solar mini grids, the mini hydro systems, so that at least we can power the local economies? Then we can actually, the SMEs can move in, the productive use of energy, then we can harness the power from the energy. Then we can create epicenters of rural development from that point, the irrigation systems. Then another point that I thought, most guys will scoff when we look at the issues to do with Pumvudza. And many times, people associate it with the hard labor of digging the holes. But they never imagined the science that is beyond. What is the science beyond the Pumvudza? Look at our streams today. Look at our rivers today. They are filled with silt. Where is it coming from? From denuded lands that are not protected. But when we come in with the Pumvudza issue, which is based on the conservation agriculture principles, our soils are always covered. The natural sequestration processes of carbon, we have the yields that are consistently higher than the ones at the conventional. I think those guys in agriculture, they testify to that. That's for this when this CA was introduced, the yields have been consistently higher than the ones for the conventional agriculture. So those are the entry points that I thought could also, on our part, yes, as we invest, but we also create an opportunity of us putting us on a low carbon trajectory, sustainable development, and also the resilience building. So in conclusion, we're just simply saying the issuance of green bonds and effective regulation of carbon trading, because we still need a legal framework for the green bond. The carbon trading, we have it now. And already the UAE guys have run with their 1.5 billion on offer. And we want to develop also the local capacities, as I said earlier on, because you see, we are looking at measuring gases, the metrics, we don't know. And the government also may consider just putting in some incentives, particularly in the project preparation phases, with the verification processes, the certification processes, and you can even venture into the triple Ps with the investors. And the necessary awareness raising, and be able to utilize the carbon credits to access the necessary funds, and the close regulation of trading is critical to prevent the issue of greenwashing. Those are false claims that whatever project they're doing has got an environmental impact. So as the old adage says, if you want to walk fast, walk alone. When you want to walk far, walk together. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you.
Well done, that was excellent. Please, a big round of applause there for the principal economist in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment Promotion, and of course, the Tinashe Charles Masha Vrave. Now, interesting. Now, remember we talked about why are we talking climate change, climate financing and resource mobilization. You heard the numbers there. The green bonds, 1.4 trillion plus. You heard about Tanzania, 1 billion coming into green carbon credits, over 20 billion this year. But unfortunately, there is a downside. Well, not a downside. There is bad news. I was speaking to Arthur Nduwuduru. He was at the climate summit in the UN recently. Apparently, the Great Britain says that they've suspended or withdrawn some of their pledges under the climate deal, which is unfortunate. And also, what I also heard a couple of days ago as well, is that someone is sneakily trading carbon credits using our forests. Because, of course, imagine the huge swathes of forests that we have all around the country. You can actually trade the carbon from there, and you can actually swap and make a lot of money. It's already there. You don't have to even do a lot of work. So this is why we put this into the program to show how big resource mobilization around climate finance is. Now, without further ado, let's move to our second presenter. Now, I will ask our presenters, please, to stick to your facts, stick to the point, get to the conclusion, because this is what people are here for, so we can discuss the recommendations. I think this is what people want to hear. I think that would be important. Now, I will mention as well, speaking to the Ministry of Finance organizing team, they had asked for submissions on all of these papers that we're going to be getting today, and I'm told that all of the papers were excellent, and in fact, they had to pick the best. But it doesn't mean that the rest weren't good. It's unfortunate there's always someone who's best, someone who isn't. But for those of you who did submit papers and research documents covering all the topics over the next 3 days, I thank you, and the Ministry of Finance thanks you for your hard work, and some of the ideas in those papers will be taken on board when policy formulation is made. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Joyce Chuma, independent researcher, to come forward. She's going to be speaking towards the development of thriving national voluntary carbon market in Zimbabwe. Dr. Joyce Chuma, please. Round of applause. It's up and down. You press it, point it at that one, though, yeah?
Sorry. Which one now?
Do you have the presentation now?
So this is the downward arrow, this is the one.
Same?
The downward arrow?
Yeah, I think it looks funny, doesn't it? So it's up and down, but I think, let's just wait for the presentation to come up. Oh, there we go. Let's try that. Is it up? one? Right, let's see. Yeah, so that's up. That's down. You see, so we can you point it at that thing.
Pleasant morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to make a presentation towards the development of a thriving national voluntary carbon market in Zimbabwe. Just before I go into my presentation, I just want to explain, give you a brief background where I'm coming from to try to explain why voluntary carbon markets. So initially, when the world decided to come together to try to address the reduction of global emissions across the world, they decided to have mechanisms to try to give incentives so that the world would do so. So from the initiation of this program, they decided that they would put permits. So in the developed world, they designed permits where they would say, for instance, you're not allowed to permit more than 10 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So those permits were tradable in that if I have 8, then the remainder 2 I can give to a fellow firm or to a fellow country. This was done in Europe mainly and in the UK. But where did the voluntary market come from? There were individuals who were corporates who were not governments because this was mandated. They decided to have their own initiative to do the same, to say if Microsoft wants to reduce their emissions, well, how can they do that? They can come to Africa, have a project, then they try to nullify the effect of their emissions with what they would be doing. So in this case, the reason why I'm focusing on voluntary carbon markets is because this is what is available for Zimbabwe. All other options in terms of carbon credits are not available. For instance, there's what you call Annex 1, where you have European countries that are developed. Then there's also Annex B. There are specific countries that are allowed to trade there, but Zimbabwe is not one of them. So all carbon markets are not available. What is simply available for now is the voluntary carbon market. So the speaker who spoke before me highlighted some of the critical issues with regards to the challenges with climate change. One being that it is working through various sectors of the economy and limiting our ability to produce, for instance, in agriculture. That is why we should care. I'm sure you acknowledge that with the same effort, a farmer 30 years ago is different from what you find in the present circumstance. And being an agro-based economy, it means we should care that we have challenges in climate change. Now, the major problem we have is that there's limited action or there's no action at all. If I can clarify, our major problem is that we are using fossil fuels. And from fossil fuels, you have got 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and 90% of that, which is carbon dioxide, is coming from fossil fuels. So our challenge is to reduce the consumption or the use of fossil fuels in order to address climate change. But now when you look at the figures, you find that from the global level, we are producing about 5.6 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's a lot. But what is the Zimbabwean problem? Zimbabwe should not really be worried about the reduction in emissions. I'm not saying it's important, it's not important. Our challenge is that we don't have enough money to take care of the problem that was not created by us, but created by other people. So most circumstances, when you look at these global markets that are already there, they were designed in order to reduce emissions. They were not worried about mobilizing climate finance. But in Zimbabwe, if you look at the statistics below there, you find that we contribute about 0.24%, which is less than 1% of the above figure, 550 million. Then you talk about being the 24th most vulnerable country, meaning that there's a paradox there. We don't contribute much to the emissions, but we are one of the countries that is suffering the most. So the rationale here is that the context of the problem is we've got limited options, but some of them were designed not for us. They are not available for us. If we want to think of carbon credits right now, the only thing we can think of are voluntary carbon markets. Then if I can reiterate what the previous speaker has said on what happened at COP15, that would expire, the commitment is expiring in 2 years, or it's no longer 2 years because we're almost out of 2023. And I know sentiments were at COP27 that they were going to try to have a voice and say, please commit to this. I know at COP28 people are going to talk about it again, but the truth is, it's very difficult for us to say that is likely to happen. Reason one being, there's no mechanism of who is going to pay. Secondly, there's no mechanism of who is going to get the money. And thirdly, there's no mechanism of how they are going to do it. So until they agree on that, maybe we'll see light and say maybe the 100 billion that is supposed to come yearly will come. But in the foreseeable future, that is unlikely to happen. So what happens to Zimbabwe? We do have a deficit of about 440 to 500 million in terms of how much we need for climate finance. And if I just focus on mitigation, our NDCs are giving us a figure of about 4.83 billion, which we need, which is showing the dire situation that we have. So that is where the carbon market is coming in, which is specifically the voluntary carbon market, where individuals in the private sector, whether national or global, can provide that finance. So there's increasing evidence, whether it's theory and evidence, that the role of the private sector has been growing. And within our own policies, there is a framework for financing, which is largely that the private sector is going to contribute the bulk to support these notions. And also, I'm glad that at policy level, there are increasing signals to show that government is aware that the voluntary carbon market has money. Why would I say that? We've got SI 150 of 2023, SI 152, SI 158, and the recent MOU that was signed with Blue Carbon, the company from UAE. So this shows us that we are not worried about is it possible? We are more worried about then how can we capitalize on this? So the purpose of the study was just to explore the capacities that we need in order to have this kind of market, because this is what is available to us. So in essence, I developed a capacity readiness assessment tool just to show the technical, financial, and the institutional frameworks that we need in order to be able to do this. But although the framework is covering the civil society, it's covering government and private sector, for this presentation, I'm mainly focusing on government. So the overview here, I'm just trying to give you the global picture so that you understand where I'm coming from and the prospects that we have. The previous speaker reiterated on some of the aspects, so I will not go over that. But one of the important things is the current market, which I'm referring to, which is the VCM, it's not functioning well. These were private people who just thought, let's come up with a mechanism. So there were no rules. Anyone was free to measure the way they want, and anyone was free to supply whatever credits they wanted because they had control of the market. There was no regulation whatsoever. So the problem is now you have problems like lack of quality of the carbon credits. You have no regulation. You have there's lack of transparency. You don't even know how they arrive at these figures. Why is a carbon credit $4 in Africa and you find it at $80 in Europe? But it's the same thing. It's carbon dioxide, it's carbon dioxide. It doesn't matter whether it's coming from Africa or from wherever. So how did they arrive at those figures? So those are some of the challenges within the market that we have also participated in. Then the United Nations has developed a registry. The registry is very important. If you look at SI 150, they talk about the development of a registry. You will not be able to facilitate the operation of this market if you don't have a registry, which means Zimbabwe does need one, but it's very expensive. But it's good that the UN has already developed one, which makes it easier because you use less resources if you adopt such kind of a system. So the most important part is up to date from 1996 to the present times. We have about 1 billion credits, 1.8 credits that have been issued. And we are doing fairly well in terms of the region, sub-Saharan Africa. We are doing fairly well more than most of the regions, including Europe itself. So there is huge potential because these things have been working, but people were not just aware of it. Then now I want to talk about, remember I talked about that the challenges with fossil fuel. So if I can give an example, even if we have 100 billion solar panels in Zimbabwe, does it mean we are going to do away with airplanes, we are going to do away with cars? I don't think so. Reason, there's no technology so far to have a car running on solar, which means this problem is not going to go away until we get rid of the fossil fuels. So that is the reason why we need to look at the fossil fuels per se and not just any solutions, because the reason why we want to reduce the emissions is because of the fossil fuel. So if you look at that diagram there, in 2021, the market was worth 2 billion, but we project that by 2030, the market will be worth 240 billion, and by 2050, it will be worth 1.9 trillion. So they are given scenarios where we are assuming there's net zero scenario and when we don't have one, so that you are able to project where we are likely to go. So these sources are from authentic, authoritative sources that have done so much research. The International Energy Association and the World Energy Outlook, they've put a lot of research into it to try to come up with this. This tells us where we are going. So for 2021, we are done. If the projections are anything to talk about for 2030, which is quite close, and we are saying we've only capitalized on, I'll show you the digits for Zimbabwe. There's huge potential for this market. Thank you. So those are the categories that I would want to talk about. One, the previous speaker talked about, so where do we put the money? Those are the statistics. If I can take you to the third column, you find that forestry and land use gave us 4.5, and renewable energy gave us 32.4. Notably, if I take you to the next one, this is how it looks like in sub-Saharan Africa. So the ranking that you have there, I made the ranking from the database. It doesn't exist this way, but I just have add this. In terms of project count, you find Zimbabwe is at number 17 with 24 projects. Then you have Kenya at 224. But when you look at the credits themselves, Zimbabwe becomes number 3. So it's not about the number of projects you have, it's about what you are generating. But let me tell you that on the 17 that I have there, Zimbabwe only has 2 projects accountable for the position 12 that we have globally, which means the Kariba Red project and the Manica Safe Water project and the Cook Stoves are responsible for whatever is talked about in terms of Zimbabwe. We got so much money. There's speculation of, from my calculations, it goes over 200 million. But from sources that I've seen, it goes to 130 million from the Kariba Red project. So it's only 2 projects or 3 projects we are speaking of in terms of the voluntary carbon market. Nothing else has been done besides those ones. So this was the methodology that I used. It helps in coming up with a carbon market strategy. It helps to say, how do you get there in terms of the strategy itself? So this is the capacity readiness assessment too, but if you follow it through, it makes it easy to come up with a strategy. What are your objectives? So I'm just going to quickly rush through to the roadmap, which is more of preliminary work on coming up with a strategy. So in my opinion, I think the government has done fairly well with regards to setting the base that you need for a voluntary carbon market. Why do I say that? All those instruments and policies you see there, they cover in detail how we should go about it. So it will not be a scenario where you are starting from scratch. Then the objectives, I gave a scenario that if we want 10% of the market share in Africa by 2030, we need to eradicate 30 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And that should generate about $4.9 billion US for government by 2030. So those high priority areas are quite similar to what you have in the NDCs and any other documents from government. But you'd also then observe that I've attached certain figures as aligned in the documents to just say from the 30, if government was projecting that each of those areas should contribute so much, I then calculated the metrics there. So in essence, on the recommendations, one of them is that I recommend the adoption of the UN registry platform, which is an open source digital platform, to reduce costs, because it will be very difficult. And I'm also thinking technically it would be too much to ask ourselves to start from scratch. So it's better just to adopt the one that we have, then we tailor-make it for our own needs. Then the other thing is we need legislation to have the VCM within the Victoria Falls International Financial Services Center. This is the most appropriate from the financial institutions that we have in Zimbabwe. But for them to operate, they cannot do so without any regulation protecting them. For instance, when we want to talk about the legal issues, what is a carbon credit? Is it a tradable instrument? How do you classify it legally? Those provisions are not there, so we need to make that. Then there's also need for us to talk about the creation of carbon credits, carbon cooperatives. The cooperative model works well. I've seen issues in Kenya, Rwanda. These models work well in terms of mobilizing private sector finance. I gave an instance that suppose government would give 25%. There are platforms out there where donors are saying, if you have at least some commitment from your own government, we can finance projects in energy. So these are some platforms we can take advantage because the cooperatives themselves have what it takes to mobilize finance from their different sources when they come together. Then the other aspect, which is also on carbon trading incentive, I propose that government should put a lower tax rate for carbon developers, largely because Victoria Falls itself is in a special economic zone, and also it's a motivating factor. You find most people are not aware of what this really means, so we really need to help them in terms of creating demand. Then there's also need for legislation to commission an independent body. The reason is these issues are too complex to leave them within a department in a ministry. There are many issues in creating a carbon market. Then also, there's also an issue of the environmental levy. In my view, I propose also that government should have, what we have in SI 58 should be retained for foreigners and not locals. The reason being, when they initially crafted these documents or these arrangements, it would be punishing local people for what we did not do. This was largely done by other countries. So if they come from, say, Europe, then they're coming to use resources within Zimbabwe. Would it be fair for local people to have the same share in terms of what is contributed to government? The reason why I was proposing that, it would seem a bit fair. The same concept that they use in land tax is what may apply to locals, but not for foreigners. So in summary, I'm saying our local situation that we need money to finance mitigation and adaptation means we cannot use whatever was designed in Europe because it's not working for us. Then the second item is that you need the chicken before the egg. I do acknowledge it's important to have the instruments in place, but they are in place for the wrong market because whatever is there right now is not working well for Zimbabwe, which means Zimbabwe needs to create its own market. Then the other issue also, just to finish off, is that at COP27, governments were encouraged not to adopt, or they were encouraged to reject rules that don't work in carbon markets. And I concur by saying that we need government support, largely in the form of regulation, in order to support the development of VCM, which is a private sector initiative. But like I highlighted before, you cannot have the Victoria Falls operating without any legislation. It becomes very difficult. So this takes me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, ma'am. Good presentation. Thank you, Dr. Joyce Chuma. Thank you. Please, another round of applause. We did acknowledge him earlier, but I will say that the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, has joined us. George Guramatanga, welcome, sir. You know, I'm sure a lot of us are wondering, why, and I think when we were talking to Prof. Chakravarti earlier, we were saying, why is, carbon credit, climate financing, there's a lot of money in this carbon stuff, isn't there? And I think it's important that Zimbabwe, we harness it, but at the same time, under proper rules, proper markets, proper legislation. And I do this, I like this idea about the Victoria Falls International Financial Center running it, because that's exactly what there is for. And later on, I'm sure we'll hear from Justin Bungoni, who will be part of the panel. I'm sure he can give us some of his views on what can be done right here in Victoria Falls as an international center. Now, our final speaker, final presenter, before we get to the panel discussion, chaired by Honorable Chidua, I'd like to call upon W. Matsika, African Wildlife Foundation, Policy and Partnerships Officer, AWF Zimbabwe, to talk on the potential for green finances. Mr. Matsika, please, thank you. Round of applause for him, please. Okay, so it's up and down. Yeah, me point to the up and down. Okay.
Good morning. Allow me to write on all protocols observed earlier. I'm going to present to you about unlocking the potential of green finance for environmental protection. Sorry.
Can you put the presentation on? Okay, let's show it so it's down. That one's down. See?
Okay.
Yeah, up.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's one. Let's check. Where are you starting? There?
Of my presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about, no, I can be standing here, thank you. I want to talk briefly about what is green finance, and then I talk about the global trends against the local trends in green finance to identify some of the misalignments that are there that need to be addressed, and then I'll move on to talk about the challenges in unlocking green finance in Zimbabwe, and then conclude by giving some suggestions or recommendations about what should we do to unlock green finance in Zimbabwe. So before I go into green finance, maybe let me just talk briefly about why we should care about environmental protection. As we know, environment is the greatest asset that has been given to humanity. And in fact, the World Economic Forum estimates that about at least 50% of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And our estimates maybe for Zimbabwe are roughly maybe at least 60% of our GDP is dependent on nature. So the rate at which nature is being degraded or lost is very high, and IPBES estimates that the rate at which we are losing nature is about 1,000 times greater than the historical levels. And if we continue on that trajectory, it means we are undermining the ability to grow our GDP through our natural assets or our environment, which provides us with natural assets that all productive economic activities are anchored on in the country. So in terms of what is green finance, it simply means that there is no universal definition for green finance. There are various definitions, but most of them point to the fact that this is funding or money that's targeting environmentally related technologies, projects, industries, businesses, targets, performance, activities, and impacts. So that is your green finance. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, if you talk about carbon tax, this is a form of green finance. Of course, it has got its own challenges, which I will highlight later. So, also, if you talk of another example, is the tobacco levy, which is levied on the farmers who grow tobacco. It's also another form of green finance, just as examples. So, in most cases, green finance is associated with responsible investment and social, environmental, and governance frameworks, as well as sustainable finance and climate finance. So, on that chart, you can see that there we have some functions of government, which include all those several ones. But you will notice from the first graph that the amount of funding that is going to environmental protection is very limited. It's the least among all those government functions, and it's about 0.15%. Even if you look at other countries, they are relatively higher, but still very low. If you talk of Namibia, it's about 0.56% going towards environmental protection. You talk of South Africa, it's about 0.6% going to environmental protection. And to Zambia, maybe it's relatively higher at 0.8%. But as you can see, there is little going towards environmental protection. And the other graph shows us that those are the requirements for us between 2021 and 2025 to meet NDS1 targets of environmentally related pillars. And clearly from that graph, you can see that the contribution from the national budget is small, is not up to the requirements that are needed for us to achieve those environmentally related pillars. And it goes to mean that government alone would not be able to raise funding to meet those the targets of those pillars. And therefore, there is need for a whole of government approach whereby other ministries, not only the Ministry of Finance, to be involved, and not only the Ministry of Environment to be involved in mobilizing resources for environmental protection. And also there is need for a whole of society approach. We need the NGOs. We need also the private sector to also contribute towards mobilization of funding for environmental protection. So that chart there shows us about the global green development finance. And over the years 2018 and 2021, you can see that green development finance has been growing and up to almost about 30%. But if you look at the green part of that green development finance, you will notice that it has only grown by about 18%, which means that for us to achieve the global required green transition, there's more need for us to grow more of green finance. And then that's Zimbabwe's official development green finance, which is showing that although our global trend is showing that green finance is growing, albeit at a lower rate, but in Zimbabwe we notice that it is actually declining, and which means there's something wrong and we should act so that we can capitalize on green financial inflows for development. You will notice some of the challenges that I will highlight later. And then, there is some opportunity that we could tap into in terms of the global leaders who are providing green finance. You can see on the global table there are several countries, 10 countries that are leading in terms of mobilizing and providing green finance globally. And if you look at Zimbabwe, you can see also there's the top 10 that we have. But in our top 10, the major providers of green finance, such as Japan, France, are not even featuring in our top 5, which means we may need to come up with some engagement strategies to engage these countries who may help us in terms of mobilizing green finance inflows into the country. There's also an opportunity in terms of leveraging private sector development finance for renewable energy generation. So in the first chart there, you can see most of the green finance from the private sector is flowing towards energy generation, renewable energy generation. But if you look at, in our instance, most of it is going to agriculture, other sectors, that is gender and urban development, and the other one on food aid, which means we're sort of misaligned there. We need to follow the money. The money is where there is energy generation using renewable energy sources. We also need to align with global trends on the channels of deploying green finance. So again, if you look at the global trends, they are also showing that most of the green finance is being channeled through central government. It's also being channeled through other recipient government arms as well as public corporations. But in our case, that is not the case, and therefore we need to align with the channels that are popular in terms of deploying green finance. And then what is hindering green finance development in the country? Number one is we don't have a clear green economy agenda. If you look at our Vision 2030 as well as the NDS1, there is no explicit mention of the green growth agenda, which most of this is the agenda that also enables us to be mobilizing a green finance. So for stakeholders like us, before we do any initiative, we ask ourselves, are we aligned with the global, with the development agenda of the country? If we cannot just get into mobilizing green finance when at a strategic level there, the country is not talking about that green growth agenda, where where green finance is one of the key pillars. Another limitation is that of the alignment between fiscal policy and the environmental policy. There is limited alignment in that area. So you would notice that in terms of our fiscal policy, of course, we have that carbon tax that I mentioned earlier. But if you look at it, it mobilizes finances for the purposes of environmental protection, or in the name of environmental protection. But in terms of deployment of those resources, they are not really earmarked for environmental protection activities. And they may even end up financing subsidies to other sectors that are harmful to the environment and natural capital, which most of our productive activities depend on. Another limitation is the alignment also between monetary policy as well as the to the environment policy. Of course, under the Maya Declaration on Inclusive Green Growth, the RBZ make some commitments to support sustainable finance. But you also notice that we lack concrete policy actions and targets and objectives that are mainly targeted towards mobilization of green finance. Another limitation relates to lack of clarity on what is green. So, like the earlier presenter had said, there is a lot of greenwashing whereby people come up with products and market them as resolving environmental challenges, when in actual fact they are not resolving those environmental challenges. So that's one of the problems that is stemming out of lack of clarity what green finance is. So there is need for a framework that defines clearly what we mean in terms of green finance. Another one relates to the lacking of functional green finance institutions. Of course, we have the Environment Fund, we also have the Water Fund, but they are not currently properly functioning well. And even if you look at how they are administered, comparing to other countries, the responsible authorities, like for instance, development banks who are in charge of managing those funds. But in our case, it's mainly the authorities that fall under, for instance, for environmental management fund is EMA. So the question is really, are those institutions really capacitated enough to be running such funds? The last one is the misalignment with the global green finance trend. Like I indicated earlier, the channels through which we are deploying green finance are misaligned with the popular channels that are used globally. And then, what are other countries doing in Africa? We look at Rwanda; they have a sustainable finance roadmap for 2022 to 2029, which clearly articulates what sustainable finance means to them and the actual steps that they need to put in place or to take in order for them to reach their ambitions of sustainable green finance. They have also been piloting some green rating of SMEs, which means that they will be extending credit based also on the fact that they extend more credit to SMEs that are green. In South Africa, for instance, there is a national green finance taxonomy, which explains what they really mean when they say green finance, and this avoids challenges that are associated with green washing. And also in their stress testing for banks, they have also a benchmark scenario for climate stress testing, which shows that they are integrating nature as well as environmental issues in their work. In the case of Uganda, they are doing public expenditure reviews that for green growth, which try to assess to what extent is the fiscal policy of Uganda delivering in terms of green growth and sustainable finance. And also, all government bodies in Uganda are requested to come up with a budget for environment, climate, as well as biodiversity, which means it's not only the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Finance that has to do that, but it's a whole of government approach. All the government bodies should contribute towards making sure that environment is sustainably used and managed. And also in Uganda, the budget cannot pass if it is not certified as climate friendly in Parliament. So there is that requirement that the budget has to be climate smart for it to be passed in Parliament. So some suggestions in terms of what should we do in Zimbabwe to unlock green finance. Number one, we should integrate a clear green growth agenda in the key national policy documents, so that it creates that demand for green products and services. Another one is to align fiscal policy to environmental objectives, and this includes several things. Those that I've mentioned there, they're just the suggestions. They are not exhaustive. For instance, you could undertake fiscal environmental sustainability reviews to make sure that you identify the areas which the fiscal policy is not aligned and where we need to address. There's also a development and implementation of green procurement frameworks. Currently, we don't have such procurement frameworks, and here, surely the government should lead in terms of promoting green growth and green finance by requesting that where they will require to be procuring services and goods from enterprises that are green. And also,
In conclusion.
so another one is to align the monetary policy, and this includes promoting green deposits, coming up with the national taxonomies on green finance, and also coming up with those stress testing that are sensitive to environmental issues. There's also need to capacitate existing non-functional green finance infrastructure, as well as deploying green finance and developing green finance and green growth information systems. For instance, promoting natural capital accounting, as well as the ESG risk management, as well as disclosure frameworks. And finally, investing and addressing bottlenecks that are associated with our limited use of popular channels for deploying green finance. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Please, a big round of applause. W. Matsika, African Wildlife Foundation Policy and Partnerships Officer. Watching his presentation there, I thought a lot of the things he was recommending are doable, aren't they? We're talking here about defining what green finance is, policy coordination between fiscal and environmental policies. We're talking about lack of green finance institutions. I suppose that's something I see a lot of bankers here. I think suddenly the bankers' minds are going, yeah, let's start opening green finance institutions. There's a lot of money in it. And of course, climate change is the biggest threat to the world at the moment. And I think even though it could be a big threat, Zimbabwe can also take advantage of what's happening in the climate to resource mobilize. Now then, we are going to take a tea break. You, of course, are with us, watching us here at the Zimbabwe Economic Development Conference, ZEDCON 2023, second edition, public and private resource mobilization for sustainable development. And those of you who are watching online on ZTN Prime, please keep your views, your comments, your thoughts coming through. We'll see if we have time in the Q&A to try and pick some of those and ask our panelists and various dignitaries here at ZEDCON 2023. Let them come in. This is an exclusive Zimbabwean conference. Everyone in Zimbabwe can participate, not only those who are here. So we will be taking a short tea break. We're now at, what is our time? We're now at 10:51. I think we can give 20 minutes tea, so I think if we say, let's assume it's 10:02. So we say 10 past 11, if we can all come back, 11:10, we can all please be back here because we have quite a lot to do. We have time to catch up this morning. Tea break, tea is served outside. I will see you after the break. Thank you. Hello, everyone. The other one. Hello, everyone. Tea will be served downstairs, please. Tea will be downstairs, there by the restaurant. Thank you.
One, two, 1, 2.